مادرهای فرزند از دست داده تسلیت عرض می‌کنم.
I have no notion, and I don't expect to go there if the Hindu-Muslim question is not.
Welcome to The Debate. Hello, we are back here with Command Figures. In 1930, a man in a homespun loincloth picked up a handful of mud and salt from a beach. And in doing so, he effectively crippled the greatest colonial empire on earth.
It is pretty incredible to think about.
It really is. And then, 49 years later, a cleric in exile recorded a series of cassette tapes that systemically dismantled a heavily armed Western-backed monarchy. How? I mean, when we think about state power, we usually picture physical force, right? Tanks, military bases, prisons.
Yeah, the tangible stuff. But functionally, well, state power is a lot like a currency. It only has value as long as millions of people believe in it and, agree to use it on a daily basis.
Exactly.
And the moment a population collectively stops believing in that currency, the moment they withdraw their daily cooperation, the state simply evaporates. I mean, the tanks are completely useless if no one will deliver the fuel for them. That is the mechanics of mass mobilization, or, unarmed insurrection.
Right. And today we are examining two of the 20th century's most monumental architects of this specific type of revolution, Mahatma Gandhi in India and Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini in Iran. Both leaders masterminded massive movements that broke the monopoly of entrenched regimes, and they did it without relying on traditional military warfare. They proved that a state cannot function if the people fundamentally refuse to participate in it.
And crucially, both of them succeeded precisely where armed guerrilla factions had completely failed. They realized early on that you cannot fight a modern, highly funded military apparatus with just a handful of smuggled rifles.
Which brings us to the central tension of our discussion today. When comparing the struggles led by Gandhi and Khomeini, is the fundamental difference in how their revolutions ended, rooted in their ideological commitment to the relationship between means and ends? Or is it primarily a strategic adaptation to the structural realities of consolidating power in their respective eras?
Right, the classic ideology versus structure debate.
Exactly. I will argue that the difference is fundamentally philosophical. Gandhi believed means and ends were inseparable, demanding strict nonviolence, whereas Khomeini used religion instrumentally, utilizing whatever means necessary to achieve an Islamic state.
And I will argue that both leaders initially relied heavily on identical strategies of nonviolent mass mobilization. The true divergence was dictated by the structural and political vacuums they faced during the climax and aftermath of their revolutions.
Well, let's lay the groundwork with the underlying ideologies. And let's start with Gandhi. For him, the philosophy of satyagraha, which translates to truth force, and ahimsa, meaning nonviolence, they were not just tactics.
No, they were foundational.
Right. They explicitly rejected the idea that a good end justifies bad means. Gandhi argued that the process had to embody the goal. If you want a peaceful society, your revolution must be peaceful. If you take a violent path, the leaders who emerge will inevitably be just as tyrannical as the British leadership they replace. The violence fundamentally infects the outcome.
Which is a beautiful philosophy, but let's contrast it with the reality of statecraft.
I will. Let's contrast it directly with Khomeini's formulation of vilayat-e-faqih, the guardianship of the Islamic jurist. Khomeini's approach was an instrumental use of religion to delegitimize the Shah and essentially trap the silent clergy into supporting him.
You think it was purely instrumental?
Yes. The rhetoric ultimately served the singular end of seizing total state power.
Well, let's pause on that claim. We have to look at the mechanics of the state apparatus they were actually fighting. The Iranian Revolution, much like the Indian independence movement, was fundamentally an unarmed insurrection, because frankly, violence was structurally useless in the beginning.
Right, against the Shah's military.
Exactly. The divergence wasn't just about moral philosophy, but about the nature of the state apparatus they were fighting and the threats they faced. Specifically, Khomeini's need to outmaneuver highly organized Marxist factions to avoid being overthrown. That is a structural pressure Gandhi did not face in the same way.
Let's test whether it was just a structural difference by looking at phase 1, the incubation of their oppositions. For Gandhi, we are looking at 1919 through the 1920s. For Khomeini, the 1960s and 70s.
Right.
In 1922, Gandhi was leading the non-cooperation movement, and it was working. It was terrifying the British. But then, the Chari Chara incident occurred.
The police station fire.
Yes, a protesting crowd was fired upon by British police, and the crowd retaliated violently, burning down the station and killing the officers. Now, Gandhi's absolute commitment to nonviolence superseded everything. He withdrew the entire national movement.
Which is incredible restraint.
It is. He essentially told his followers that if they weren't ready to suffer violence without retaliating, they weren't ready for independence. Contrast that moral absolute with Khomeini in 1963. During his Ashura speech, he deliberately compared the Shah to Yazid, the ultimate villain in Shia history. So I see why you think their early tactics were similar, but wasn't Khomeini's use of religious holidays a form of preference falsification to essentially force the masses and rival clerics into compliance, rather than Gandhi's goal of genuine moral conversion?
Okay, let's unpack the preference falsification part. Under a brutal regime like the Shah's, citizens privately despise the government, but publicly they comply out of pure fear. Everyone thinks they are the only one who wants a revolution.
Right, the illusion of universal support.
Exactly. And yes, Khomeini used Ashura specifically to break that illusion. It provided built-in physical immunity because millions were already gathering for religious mourning. That lowers the threshold of fear. The preference falsification shatters. But I mean, let's not pretend Gandhi didn't also strategically rally the forces of nature and religion to his side.
He definitely used cultural symbols, yes.
Right, to lower the threshold of fear for Indian peasants. Furthermore, we have source material showing Khomeini explicitly reprimanding young Islamist guerrillas in the late 60s and 70s.
When they came to Najaf?
Yes, they wanted his blessing for armed struggle, and he told them no. He explicitly said the regime would not fall by armed struggle, but when the clerical stratum joined the opposition. That shows a shared strategic brilliance. They both realized the power of mass, nonviolent integration over pure violence.
But that is a tactical calculation, not a moral one. Khomeini's rejection of the guerrillas was simply a realization that violence wouldn't work yet.
You think he was just biding his time?
Absolutely. Gandhi's objection was a foundational moral absolute. But okay, let's move to phase 2, the climax of mass mobilization, the turning points.
The 1930 Salt March versus the 1978 oil strikes.
Exactly. For Gandhi, he specifically chose the salt tax because it affected the absolute poorest citizens. But look at how he initiated it. He wrote a letter to the Viceroy Lord Irwin beforehand.
Telegraphing his moves?
Entirely. He clearly stated his intentions, reflecting the pure transparency of satyagraha. The opponent must know your moves. Now, compare this to Khomeini's handling of the late 1978 Iranian oil strikes. Khomeini called them a holy strike. He used terms like mustasafin, the oppressed, basically to steal Marxist rhetoric and mobilize workers.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that this is purely about transparency versus manipulation.
Really? It seems like a stark contrast in intent.
Functionally, Gandhi's boycott of foreign goods and Khomeini's weaponization of the oil strikes with the exact same mechanism, paralyzing the state's economic monopoly.
Well, they both stopped revenue, sure.
It goes deeper than revenue. The 1978 oil strike successfully created a dual power situation that forced the Shah out. The Shah formally commands the military. He has the tanks. But the revolutionary committees control the fuel needed to drive those tanks. The military gets paralyzed.
Exactly. And this identically mirrors Gandhi's economic disruption tactics, creating parallel institutions, making your own salt, spinning your own cloth. It renders the state completely irrelevant.
The mechanics of disruption might look identical in the moment, but the underlying ideology dictates what happens next. Which brings us to Phase 3, the aftermath and consolidation of power.
1947 versus 1979.
Right. As India achieved independence in 1947, Gandhi continued to act as a peace builder. He was fasting, attempting to unite Hindus and Muslims. He refused to dictate the new government.
He stayed out of formal office, yes. Conversely, upon returning to Iran in February 1979, Khomeini immediately empowered Sadiq Khalkhali to summarily execute the Shah's top generals for, quote, declaring war on God. I mean, they took them to the rooftop of a school and shot them. This is the ultimate proof that Khomeini's ends justified brutal means, while Gandhi remained tethered to his principles.
That's a compelling argument, but have you considered that Gandhi was fighting an empire that agreed to an institutional transfer of power, whereas Khomeini was navigating a total state collapse and faced heavily armed, highly organized domestic rivals?
You're saying the executions were just a structural necessity?
Our source explicitly notes a direct historical analogy here. Khomeini transformed from a Gandhi into a Lenin out of fear of becoming the Alexander Kerensky of Iran.
Meaning the moderate who gets swept away by the radicals.
Exactly. Kerensky helped topple the Tsar in Russia, hesitated, and got crushed by the Bolsheviks. Khomeini faced an immediate existential threat from mushrooming Marxist groups like the Fedayeen Khalq.
Who had fought alongside him.
Yes, they were part of the coalition, but they were heavily armed and highly organized. If Khomeini didn't move ruthlessly to decapitate the Shah's remaining military to prevent a royalist coup and simultaneously outbid the leftists, his nascent republic would have been overthrown.
I mean, I have to push back hard on the idea that Gandhi faced no structural existential threats. India was literally tearing itself apart. The threat was a total sectarian civil war.
Right. Partition was devastating.
Millions were slaughtered, and Gandhi's response to that existential threat was to risk his own life through fasting to force a moral awakening. Khomeini's response to his threat was to monopolize violence and enshrine absolute power into the theology. The executions aren't just a reaction, they are the logical conclusion of his instrumental ideology.
But you can't divorce that ideology from the Cold War environment. The US had already orchestrated a coup in Iran in 1953. Khomeini knew a Western-backed counter-revolution was highly probable if he didn't dismantle the apparatus completely.
So the geopolitical stakes justify abandoning the nonviolent premise?
I'm saying structural survival drove the outcome just as much as ideology. If Gandhi was in Cold War-era Iran facing the Savak and armed Marxists, his moral framework would have been crushed by the structural realities of that political vacuum.
Well, we can't know the counterfactual, but looking at the timeline, the divergence really remains deeply philosophical. Gandhi's ahimsa laid the foundation for a secular democracy. Khomeini's instrumental Islamism inherently built a theocratic republic that relied on repression.
Because the mechanics of state consolidation demanded different tools in those different eras. Though I think we can definitely converge on the fact that both leaders possessed an unmatched genius for understanding their people.
Absolutely. They both cracked the code of utilizing mass mobilization. They broke the monopoly of powerful regimes without relying on traditional military warfare.
Yeah, they bypassed the old rules of warfare entirely.
They did. And understanding how nonviolent mass movements can lead to such drastically different types of modern states, a secular democracy versus a theocratic republic, really requires deep exploration of these complex figures.
There is definitely so much more to explore in the history here.
Always. Thank you for listening. Do not forget to click like and subscribe and write your opinion in the comment section.